Landmark Preservation Board this morning. The first meeting is going to be a public hearing regarding the potential locally designated status of the Temple Concord property. After that, the meeting will be closed, and the regularly scheduled meeting will commence, at which time, after an agenda item of 4 or 5 items, there will be discussion among the board as to the decision of designation. Excuse me. So with that, I call the meeting to order, the public hearing of the City of Syracuse Landmark Preservation Board. And let me see here. Okay, going forward, a couple of quick things. Please, cell phones off, on vibrate, and try to keep any discussion within the audience to a minimum so that people have a chance to speak and be heard. So notice is hereby given that a public hearing will be held on Thursday, February 6th, year 2020 at 8:30 a.m. in the Common Council Chambers, City Hall, Syracuse, New York, to consider whether the property located at 910 Madison Street, Temple Society of Concord, should be recommended for designation as a local protected site pursuant to the zoning rules and regulations of the City of Syracuse as amended. The Syracuse Landmark Preservation Board, in exercising its powers and duties pursuant to Part C, Section 7, Article 1 through 9 inclusive of the zoning rules and regulations of the City of Syracuse, to determine if the building or structure shall be designated as a protected site, shall consider the following. 1. Association with persons or events of historic significance to the city, region, state, or nation. 2. Illustrative of historic growth and development of the city, region, state, or nation. 3. In the case of structures embodying distinctive characteristics of type, period, or method of construction, or representing the work of a master, or possessing unique architectural and artistic qualities, or representing a significant and distinguishable entity whose component may lack individual distinction. And 4, in the case of interiors, possessing one or more of the characteristics enumerated in number 1, number 2, or number 3 above. And in addition, embodying distinctive characteristics of architectural scale, form, visual homogeneity, which are an integral part of the character of the structure in which the space is contained. Persons wishing to appear may do so in person or by attorney. Communication in writing in relation thereto may be filed with the Syracuse Landmark Preservation Board, 201 East Washington Street, room 512, Syracuse, New York, 13202, or at such hearing. And I am Don Radke, Chairman of the Syracuse Landmark Preservation Board. I want to note for the record that we have received a series of letters, both in support and not, of the designation, and they are being submitted for the public record. Okay, this is how we're going to proceed. First and foremost, the sole purpose of this particular meeting is to speak to and give reasons why the property should or should not be designated as a local protected site. We are not here, and I will not entertain discussion of economic viability, of a philosophical discussion about what may or may not go there. This is a discussion solely about the significance or lack thereof of this property and whether it is to be designated. So with that, I'd like to have you come to the mic, give your name, give your address, and we'll start with those speaking in favor of designation, either the entire property or part of the property. So just one by one, come up to the microphone, give us your name, give us your address, and again, these are people speaking in favor of the designation.
Hi, my name is Sam Gruber. I'm an architectural historian and preservationist. I'm also a member of the congregation. I'm speaking on my own behalf and not for the congregation. I'm speaking for the protected site designation of the sanctuary building, but not for the adjacent 1929 buildings or the 1960s school building. And I'll give the reasons for that going forward. My remarks are not in writing, but I wrote the National Register nomination in 2008. I was also co-chair of the Building Centennial Committee in 2010 and 2011, and I wrote and spoke a lot about the history of the building at that time. I've also given many public lectures in Syracuse about the significance of the building, its architect, and its role in the City Beautiful movement in Syracuse in the early 1900s. I've mentioned the book in detail or in passing. I've mentioned the synagogue in detail and passing in at least 2 books that I've written and several articles, and I think these are all available to the Landmarks Preservation Board. I moved to Syracuse over 25 years ago. I looked for a synagogue to join because of my experience and professional involvement in the protection and preservation of historic Jewish sites around the world. At that time, I was director of the Jewish Heritage Program of the World Monuments Fund, and I was the research director of the U.S. Commission for the Preservation of America's Heritage Abroad. I was delighted to find in Syracuse a remarkable architectural work that was also a vibrant Jewish congregation, and that was still located in the heart of the city at its historic location at Madison and University, close by the university and also close by the downtown. I joined with my family, and I spent many years devoted to the building, to its history, but also I spent more than 16 years as a member of the facilities committee of the synagogue, during which time I was involved in many projects for the repair and restoration of the building, including writing grants and obtaining funds, modest funds, from institutions like the New York Landmarks Conservancy Sacred Sites Fund for preservation of the masonry and other features. I have watched with dismay and despair, as many of us have over the years, as the size of the congregation has shrunk, but expenses, more for staff than for building, have increased, putting the congregation in a very dire financial situation, and making the future viability of the building and the complex uncertain. I was, however, shocked when I heard about the sale of the building, and despite my professional credentials and my history with the building, I was not consulted about the sale, nor about options for protection and preservation. I think the Rubicon has been crossed and the congregation is going to move. I'm still devoted to the congregation. My goal is to see development happen on the site, which I think is permissible and possible, but development that also protects and preserves the historic features of the complex that are most important. And for me, that is the sanctuary building that was begun in 1910, dedicated in 1911, and designed by Alfred Taylor and Arnold W. Brunner. Taylor was a notable architect locally in both the arts and crafts movement and for institutional building. And Arnold Brunner was probably the leading, or one of the 2 or 3 leading architects in the country at the time when he was consulting architect. He was president of the New York AIA. When he stopped in Syracuse to meet with the building committee, he was en route probably to Cleveland, where his great federal building was being dedicated in 1910. He was the sole surviving member of the Cleveland plan of Daniel Burnham, John Carrere, and Brunner. And as part of that trio, he was one of the founders of the City Beautiful, or the City Practical movement, as he defined it, and went on to make major contributions to American urban planning in places from New York to Harrisburg, Albany, Denver, Rochester, and many cities throughout the country. His design for the building epitomizes his belief in the Roman classical or the Greek classical style for Jewish building, of which I've written about in an article called Arnold Bernhard and the New Jewish Classicism, finding that this classicism was the ideal expression for American Judaism, for Reform Judaism, but also it was the closest to ancient synagogues, which at that time were being excavated, and of which he was very well aware. He was the most prolific writer on the history and architecture of synagogues in the English language from the 1890s through his death in 1925. I think it's a no-brainer to preserve and protect the sanctuary. It meets every criteria which you just read, notable people, 3 important rabbis, Adolf Gutmann, Benjamin Friedman, Ted Levy, for certain, all of whom contributed vastly, both nationally and locally, to both Jewish and national affairs, and then other distinguished rabbis since then. More recently, major members of the Syracuse civic and business and cultural communities have been members and have participated in both the design and building and the use of the building. Gates Thalheimer was Rabbi Gutmann's partner in the construction. T. Aaron Levy was one of the many, the social activist was one of the many participants. Louis Marshall, the great civil rights, human rights advocate, was a longtime and lifelong member, even though he moved to New York. All of these have deep roots in the congregation and in this particular building. And it was probably through Louis Marshall, in fact, who wrote a rather dreadful poem that was read at the dedication, that Brunner was actually probably brought to the congregation to help the design. The building is almost immaculate. Of existing synagogues of this period in this country, it ranks among the very best preserved. The congregation has taken loving care of the building for a century. If you look in my book from 2003, 2004 on American synagogues, you'll see a picture where there's actually ugly air conditioning ducts on the right side. Soon after that book was published, those were moved, and approximately $350,000 was spent to restore all of the original plaster work on that south side of the sanctuary, and at the same time to repair the steel girders in the roof that were not visible. Similarly, masonry work was done on a routine schedule on the outside, and major work was done supporting the flooring of the social hall just in recent years, cost about $80,000. So the congregation has been dedicated to the protection and preservation of the building for decades, and has never been shy about talking about how great the building is. And it's been a major point of pride, but also of promotion for the congregation that it is in this building. I just want to reference, at the time that I wrote the National Register nomination, I sent a memo to the board, which circulated and was approved, apprising the board of the consequences of National Register designation, and telling them that the private owner, in this case Temple Site of Concord, is free to sell, alter, and demolish the property. However, I also stipulated that even as an eligible property, as it was at that time, let alone designated, demolition itself would automatically trigger a review similar to what is happening now. At that time, no one dreamed that there would even be the possibility of demolishing the building, because we were looking forward to a vibrant, a new century. Notable people, the role of the synagogue in the eastward expansion of the Jewish community, the building of a new monumental center between Syracuse University and the downtown. As an example of the City Beautiful movement and classicism, it's one of 4 or 5 major buildings along with Central High School, County Courthouse, Carnegie Library, and others that make up that group. And then because of the really perfect expression of Brunner's own classicism that's embodied in the building today, all of those are reasons for protecting and preserving the building. Now, the building grew, the congregation grew, and so additional additions were added. As you know, the 1910 Social Hall, which you've seen in the plans that are in the 1912 architecture article, that was entirely remodeled in about 1929. When I wrote the National Register nomination, we didn't know who the architect of that was. We know it was Wolf Markham, who was a congregant who did that work, and presumably he was also the architect of the 1929 classroom building, which faces Madison Street. While those 2 buildings are very good buildings, I don't think they meet the same criteria as the sanctuary, and therefore I don't feel as strongly that they need to be protected and fought for preservation. I think there are other merits, particularly to the classroom building on Madison Street, that would warrant its preservation or at least incorporation into any new design, because of its scale and because when it was built, it clearly was corresponding to the Madison School across the street. But I think that's more an issue for the Planning Commission than for this body. Even when we wrote the 2008 designation, we made it clear that the 1960 school building, which already was not in great shape, would not be included in the designation. And I even have a note here from Alan Kossoff, by the way, whose father built the Sherbrooke apartment right next door down the street for Ward Wellington Ward. And he's actually making sure that if we had chose to demolish the school building in the future, that would not be a problem. And at that time, I assured him that would be the case, and I still believe that the school building is expendable. It is an example of 1960 modern building, but it's not well constructed, and it's not a particularly innovative design. And we have several others in the city that are better or comparable. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm available for any questions and information. I want to add, though, I'm very sympathetic to the needs of the congregation. I do hope that my congregation can continue and survive, and that some development on this property can take place that protects both the history and the architecture, but can provide financial support to sustain the community in the future. My dream would have been to see development on the property as a partnership between the congregation and a private developer, which would have allowed the synagogue to maintain the sanctuary and perhaps have space in any new development. But I think, as I said, we've crossed the Rubicon. That's not going to happen, and we need to move forward, in my mind, to both protect the building and protect the congregation and get the best project built on that very important corner site. Thank you.
Thank you. The next person wishing to speak in favor of the designation, and while that person's coming up, I want to neglect to introduce the newest member of our board, member in training. We all know what it's like to be a parent. So who else is looking to speak in favor of the designation? Please come forward. And again, give us your name and your address.
Thank you for taking my testimony. I'm Susan Edmonds. I live at 917 Madison Street, across the street from Temple Concord. And I just wanted to pick up a point that the last speaker made about the 1960s schoolroom. And while he finds that the value does not meet a certain kind of historic test, I want to make a different kind of point. He spoke about how it was clearly designed to be in sympathy with the Madison Court condominium building across the street, which I understand from minutes of your board from a previous meeting is itself eligible for landmark status. That kind of architectural inscription of a bond with the surrounding community and an open embrace of a neighborly relationship is one of the things that has always marked the Temple Concord property and the presence of the congregation in the area. So I think that you can see written into the architecture of the 1960s built classroom a commitment to rhyme with the surrounding community, which I think is worth preserving. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else interested in speaking in favor of the designation?
Good morning. My name is Michael Garrity. I live at 124 Hertford Street, City of Syracuse. I'm a New York State licensed architect based here in the City of Syracuse and have been before you before on a number of my North Salina Street projects where we've restored storefronts and redeveloped existing buildings. I'm here to support the petition for protected site status. My research will duplicate much of what our previous speaker mentioned, but the Temple Concord Society is the 9th oldest active Jewish congregation in the United States, started in 1839. The building was dedicated in 1911, and that did include the social hall in addition to the sanctuary. And it was a major ecumenical occasion in Syracuse, widely reported by the local press. The Syracuse Post-Standard stated, and I quote, "Simplicity and dignity, two marked characteristics of the house of worship, were emphasized at the dedication of the massive synagogue of the Temple Society of Concord. The new temple is one of the most impressive buildings in Syracuse." Temple Concord was also an example of the leading Jewish architect in our nation, Arnold Bernhard, and he was also a leading architect in general, as previously mentioned, president of both the Architectural League in 1903-04 and the New York chapter of the American Institute of Architects in 1910. He was at the height of his career at the time he designed the temple. The temple is an outstanding example of the neoclassical revival style, popular here in the United States following the World Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago up to around the First World War. The temple sanctuary interior is still basically intact with the curved benches and the ark where the sacred Torah scrolls are used during the worship services. The ark's design can be traced back to the 4th century from examples found in Turkey. I firmly believe that the entire building complex and grounds should be considered by the Preservation Board as significant and worthy of protected site. It is common in religious buildings that the sanctuary is the primary focus, and the most attention to architectural detail is established there. The ancillary support spaces like a social hall or classrooms necessarily have a reduction in the level of detail so that the sanctuary is prominent. At the time of its listing in 2009 on the National Register, the entire complex was included in the description, including the 1960 educational wing, which was listed as not necessarily historically significant, but it was included on the register. It is the fate of many religious congregations with declining membership in large historically significant buildings that they are no longer able to afford the upkeep and maintenance of their buildings. Furthermore, I am not unaware of the economies afforded in real estate development to start from a blank slate, nor the potential profits to be incurred from such a massive project as proposed. But they are not sufficient reasons to allow the tear down and elimination of the fabric and history of our city. I personally led the design team that resurrected the 1920s vintage Will Rogers Tuberculosis Hospital in Saranac Lake. We gutted the interior deteriorated structures. It had been vacant for about 20 years. It was last used as a dormitory in the 1980 Lake Placid Olympics. It had been used as temporary inhabited by vagrants, partying teenagers, and the occasional raccoon. Ed Riley had a vision for this Hotel Syracuse to similar success. It is now a vibrant center within our community that might have been lost in the search for maximum profit. Demolition is not needed. Alternative uses are available and will be found with vision to save our history. I suggest to you, the Landmark Preservation Board, that you are our first step to help ensure that in our city we will cherish our historical buildings and help others to find new uses for when they outlast their original purpose. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else looking to speak in favor of the designation? Please come forward.
Good morning. My name is Douglas H. Zamelis, and I'm the legal representative of Sherbrooke, Inc., the owner of the Sherbrooke Apartments property located at 922 Madison Street. The Sherbrooke was designed, as we heard, by renowned Syracuse architect Ward Wellington Ward in 1918, and our property shares a boundary with Temple Concord. Now, incidentally, my client has always found Temple Concord a good neighbor, and we bear no ill will towards the organization or the congregation. To the contrary, we hold them in the highest esteem and regard. The Sherbrooke's listed on the National Registry and was designated a protected site in 1980 under the very same regulations that you'll be applying today for Temple Concord. Your regulations provide 4 criteria for designating protected sites, and if you find that Temple Concord meets any one of those criteria, you should report and recommend to the Planning Commission and the Common Council that Temple Concord be designated a protected site. We submit this determination shouldn't be difficult or controversial. As you heard from Mr. Gruber and Mr. Garrity, Temple Concord easily meets all 4 of the criteria for designated sites. The property is closely associated with people and events of historical significance. It wonderfully illustrates the city's growth and development since the early part of the last century. It's an outstanding example of neoclassical revival architecture still in use for its original intended religious purpose today. And the interior embodies several distinctive characteristics of scale, form, and homogeneity, which are all integral parts of this important structure. Now, we also want to emphasize your regulations define protected site as, quote, a parcel of land, comma, together with a building or structure thereon. So the designation would apply to the entire Temple Concord parcel and not just a portion or particular part of the site or building. As a matter of law, your regulations do not contemplate site or structure splitting. Either the parcel is designated or it's not. So on behalf of Sherbrooke, Inc., we respectfully request that you acknowledge the evidence in the record and make specific written findings that Temple Concord meets all 4 of the applicable criteria for designation, and report and recommend that it be designated a protected site so that it can be afforded all of the benefits and protections thereof. Now, Mr. Chairman and members of the board, a personal note. I was recently in Cologne, Germany, and for me the highlight of Cologne was the cathedral. When I took my family to Paris recently, our meeting place was Notre Dame, and that was before the fire. And I was just in Savannah visiting my son, and the walking tour ended at the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. And it occurs to me that our religious institutions and our landmarks not only help define a city's skyline, but also its culture and its soul. Temple Concord helps define not just Syracuse skyline, but also its culture and its character. So it would be arbitrary and capricious for this board not to designate Temple Concord a designated protected site. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else looking to speak in favor of the designation? Hearing none, anybody looking to speak in favor of the designation?
Good morning. My name is Stephen Buckner, landscape architect. I live at 1234 James Street at Treetops. I'm an urban planner, developer of Syracuse Urban Housing, and the former first chair of the Landmark Preservation Board back in the 70s, a while ago. 50 years, something like that. Anyway, I support the landmark preservation designation of the Temple Concord building and site. It meets all the criteria noted for designation. The proposed developer, Landmark Properties, and I like their title, Landmark Properties. I assume that they have developed other landmark properties, hopefully. They have an opportunity to take some of the adjunct wings that we've been talking about, not the school, but the adjunct wings, and do a very good adaptive reuse for housing, rather than tearing those down. I'm not including the school. I think the school can be taken down. The scale of the new development must be in scale with the neighborhood buildings, 2 to 4 story buildings, and the approved landmark status with the provision that the sanctuary be preserved, and if any changes are proposed, that they be approved by the Landmark Preservation Board. Just as a side, the next step in the University Hill area should be the preparation of architectural and site design guidelines. Some of the new student housing is ugly. It's poorly built. Someday will probably be in tear-down situation. They're totally out of scale and lack all architectural detail. So that is just a little aside of my feeling of what's going on in the University Hill area. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else looking to speak in favor of the designation?
Hi, I'm Judy Lee. I was a little bit late, so I'm assuming no one said this, and I just wanted to add a couple of comments to the beautiful things everyone has said. I love Temple Concord, and I just want to see it move forward in a way that does it justice. It's just a beautiful building. It's breathtaking from the inside, and I practically fainted the first time I walked into it, seeing how lovely it was. Again, if no one mentioned it, I just wanted to bring up the little corridor that it's on with the Sherbrooke Apartments was mentioned, and the Madison Schools across the street, and the Ward Wellington, sorry, let me find it. Oh, the Grace Episcopal Church on the corner, and the Horatio Nelson White Building and the Herbert Walker House are all in that same area. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else looking to speak in favor of the designation?
I'm Bob Hailey, an architect and a planner. I appreciate all your comments. This is the public input where we can hear from individuals the history and significance from your point of view. Sam, thank you, Professor Gruber, for this. We should all get credit for your last presentation. My question to you on the histories is, can you share with us in a fairly focused form the previous history of the Jewish temples in the 15th Ward and how it might have evolved to form this particular Temple Concord Society? And maybe, was this, in other words, was this the first building by a new community, or was it an evolution from our long-lost past of the 15th Ward's original smaller wooden synagogues?
Thanks. No, this was not the first new synagogue building built in Syracuse. In fact, it's not even the first building of Temple Concord. As previously mentioned, Temple Concord was founded 1838, 1839. It was in rented quarters, moved a few times, and this is all documented in B.G. Rudolph's book, From a Minion to a Community. And then in 1850-51, they had enough money, they had enough members to build their own purpose-built synagogue, and this was erected on the site of where the Everson Museum is now, at Harrison and State. They had a cemetery, which is up in on the north side. Why am I blanking on the name of the great cemetery? There, on Lodi and Rose Hill, sorry. And that was the first Jewish cemetery. The congregation continued to grow, but it also splintered, and there were divisions in the community as the Reform movement became dominant in the congregation. The original founders, many of the original more traditional German-speaking immigrant founders, split off and founded another shul, became known as the Rosenblum shul. They later merged back in. Meanwhile, in the latter part of the 19th century, more different immigrants came in from different countries with different rituals, speaking different languages, different traditions, and they tended to build their own smaller synagogues. By the interwar period, when most of the 15th Ward was settled and then the first demolitions began with Pioneer Homes, there were, I think, about 8 synagogues in that area, small synagogues in that area. Temple Concord already moved before World War I to the east because their more affluent members were moving out of the old inner city, but they also wanted to be in this new civic environment near the university, which was founded in the early 1870s. On this, what we now call the connective corridor, really was a connective corridor there with a number of grand houses, which some of which would be replaced, and Temple Concord, in fact, replaced the Gardner estate when it was built in 1910-11. So it was a move up. It was representative of the German-speaking Reform congregation, generally more affluent, and we would say, if not assimilated, more acculturated, and much more engaged now that they were second and third generation in civic affairs. And they wanted a building that reflected that. And the siting of the building is very specifically discussed in the building minutes, which we discovered after the National Register nomination, but they liked the prominence on the hill, and they bought extra footage, and they liked the fact that it could be set back from the street. Remember, it looked towards the city, but that meant anyone coming out from the city would see it, and it was very impressive, and the other higher buildings around weren't built at that time. So it was a very conscious decision. Then after World War I, the rest of the Jewish community began to move as well. So you had a merger of Orthodox congregations which formed Beth El, which still stands today. It's the Byzantine, the Vedder designed Byzantine revival synagogue from late 1920s. And then the new conservative congregation, Temple Adith, built their building, which is now the Hotel Schuyler, designed by Gordon Wright. And all these 3 buildings were very impressive architectural structures, and they were all linked. It was like a little necklace, and you had Orthodox, Conservative, Reformed, all in union. Today, only Temple Concord survives as a functioning synagogue in that original location because of a conscious decision in the 1980s by the congregation not to move when other congregations were moving in the 60s, 70s out toward the eastern part of the city and the suburbs.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So this was the first use of this site for a religious purpose. It was the Gardner estate.
It was a large house with on open grounds, and you can get a very good view of it on the 1908 Hopkins map.
Thank you. That's perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else looking to speak in favor of the designation? Okay, there being none, anybody looking to speak in opposition of the designation? Seeing nobody in opposition of the designation? Pardon? There is one. Okay. Please come forward.
Good morning. My name is Warren Wolfson, and I'm an attorney, but I'm representing Temple Concord in my individual capacity. I'm a partner in the law firm of Hancock Estabrook. Prior to rejoining the firm in 2005, I served as Senior Vice President and General Counsel at Phase Drugs. I've previously served on the Board of Trustees of Temple Concord, and I currently serve as a member of the Temple Steering Committee, the committee charged with closing the transaction with Landmark and transitioning the Temple to a new location. I am here to speak in favor of the Preservation Board approving the plans of Landmark development as submitted. In order for you to understand my unique perspective, let me give you my family history. I've been a Temple Concord member for at least 70 years, my parents being members when I was born. I was bar mitzvahed in 1962 in the temple sanctuary. I attended religious school at the temple, and I was confirmed in 1964. My father served on the Board of Trustees and as treasurer of the temple. I held funeral services for my father, mother, and 2 stepfathers in the temple sanctuary. On a happier note, my daughter was bat mitzvahed in the temple, and her bat mitzvah held in the temple sanctuary. I've spent hundreds, if not thousands, of hours attending services in the temple sanctuary. I've listened to sermons from Rabbis Friedman, Levy, Ezring, and now Rabbi Feldman. My children and 2 local grandchildren have been named and blessed in the temple. I've contributed tens of thousands of dollars in support of the temple's preservation. I don't have to point out to you, Landmark Development has agreed to preserve the exterior of the sanctuary building intact. Now that they've agreed to preserve the historic importance of the temple, I ask you to help me preserve Temple Concord. This has nothing to do with preserving the columns in the front of the sanctuary. This has been accomplished by the developer's design. No, I ask you to help preserve Temple Concord community and Reform Judaism in Syracuse, New York. I ask you to help me preserve the presence of Rabbi Feldman and Cantor Carey for the Temple Concord community and for the city of Syracuse by approving the developer's plans as submitted. Now let me indulge you a little while by dialing 10 years ahead. Imagine that Landmark has long ago withdrawn its offer to Temple Concord. The congregation is disbanded due to the lack of funds. Rabbi Feldman and Cantor Carey have long ago moved from the community. The temple building has been abandoned and placed in the hands of the New York State Attorney General. The temple windows have been unable to withstand the onslaught of rocks thrown, some in the hands of anti-Semites, other in the hands of 13-year-olds looking for a good time. The roofs of the buildings have massive leaks and mold is growing in the classrooms. The buildings have become home to homeless squatters, and the neighborhood and drugs are prevalent. The city must do something to rid the neighborhood of this attractive nuisance. What can they do? Repairs to the building are expensive, and there's no congregation, be they Jewish, Christian, Muslim, or Hindu, able to afford to make the building habitable. So how will the city resolve this attractive nuisance problem? You both know, and I know, it will act to demolish the buildings. For all reasons stated, I ask you to support Landmark's development plans for Temple Concord property as submitted. And by doing so, preserving the Temple Concord community for me and Temple congregations for years to come. I trust my remarks will be included in the minutes of the public hearing. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. You can hand in your remarks to the staff.
I want to clarify the point that he's speaking in favor.
Yeah. You came forward speaking in opposition, but now you're talking about speaking about saving the sanctuary only. Is that correct? Okay, thank you. Anybody else looking to speak in opposition of designation?
Good morning. My name is Daniel Feldman. I'm the rabbi at Temple Concord. I think what Sam Gruber described explains the situation we're in best, which is a combination of economic factors and a desire to preserve our history and a desire for our congregation to continue growing. And so we get into the same challenge you just had of in opposition or in favor, but the solution is to preserve the sanctuary, as the developer is suggesting, and to allow them to build around the sanctuary. If they preserve the sanctuary as they're proposing, it remains a landmark in our city. It remains a reminder of who our congregation has been, and it remains an icon, a model for us to look to see the value and the importance of religious institutions in our community. It also allows our congregation to continue and thrive, and it allows the university and its areas to move forward as well. So I think the solution that Mr. Gruber suggested and that Mr. Wolfson also suggested is perhaps the best one, to preserve the sanctuary itself and to allow for the development of the rest of the piece of land. And I'm open for any questions.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi.
Again, speaking in favor.
Anybody else? Again, Rabbi and Mr. Wilson are speaking in favor of designation of the sanctuary, but in opposition of designation of the remaining parcel.
We're doing kind of fast to be in favor, so I'm going to go in favor also.
Pardon
so
me?
my name's in favor.
Speaking in favor,
Yeah.
okay.
So my name's Tim Rudd. I'm a lifelong city resident and a city councilor at large. And this is Josiah Cleary Rudd. He's also a born and raised Syracuse vet. So I've seen pictures of this, and there's something about it that feels scary when you look at it because it's so huge. But I actually think that we really, in order for Syracuse as a community to thrive, we need density, and we need vibrancy. And what we offer are historic environments, and this is one of them. So I do think there is this need to protect elements of it, but I also think there's a need to move into the future. And the future for Syracuse, like how can we compete with suburbs, is with density, vibrancy, and new housing. So it might feel unfathomable for how we will fill this or what it may do to other city neighborhoods, but I actually think the density in our core, this is literally on the connective corridor. So I went to Syracuse University twice, and it did not have a connective corridor when I went there. Like, I definitely think the vision of having a dense student environment and filling in the density all the way to downtown to make one dense whole is what will make Syracuse prosper and really compete. And the way that people fled to the suburbs with stagnant population growth for decades, I can see reversing and the roads coming in. So even if we didn't have lots of regional growth, I can see the city being successful by pursuing density, vibrancy, and really in a strategic area. And there's no place more strategic than the connective corridor for building our density. So I do appreciate all the work you've done to get to a point where we can preserve it. And I know change is hard for lots of people, but I actually do think this is sort of the thing that makes Syracuse marketable, makes people want to live in it, and this is a path forward for our community.
Thank you, Councilor. Okay, anybody else looking to speak in opposition of the designation?
My name is Joseph Greenman. I'm a retired member at Bond, Chenick and King. I was married in 1974, moved to Syracuse with my wife, and immediately joined Temple Concord, so I've been a member there for 46 years. Both my children were bar and bat mitzvahed in the sanctuary. I've been on the board of trustees twice. I'm a past president of the Temple 4 years ago, so I guess I'm the past president. Temple Concord is part of my family's life. It's here. It's very important, but the most important part of it, and I think this is the thing that we tend to lose sometimes when we look at bricks and mortars, is the congregation itself, which is the people. I didn't join Temple Concord because the building. I mean, the sanctuary is beautiful, and it's a great place to worship, but that's not why we joined it. We joined it because it was a congregation of people that you could associate with that helped us spiritually and socially and in every other way that they possibly could. I've been through 3 rabbis, and I might point out that as long as our temple has existed, we've had only 5 rabbis, which is amazing, which shows that the congregation as a whole has been incredibly together. And it's not the building that keeps us together. It's the congregation, it's our clergy, it's our people. And if we lose sight of that, it will be devastating, because we will not have a Reformed congregation in Syracuse, and that's what I am afraid of if we don't do it. I'm speaking in favor of the plan that has been submitted, because it does preserve the sanctuary, which it's a beautiful building. It's my understanding that they hope to open it for use by the community, and so it will give our members a chance to actually go back and to see it, and if it's there, it is a lasting reminder of that. The rest of the building, unfortunately, is in horrible disrepair. We had an event in the social hall, and we had to make sure that the places where it was leaking and the wallpaper was coming down in the balcony area was hidden, because it's horrible. It's very expensive, as you know, to maintain older buildings. The school building was built. I wasn't involved at the time. I wasn't here at the time, but it's a horrible building, and it's literally falling around our congregants as they exist. So I do speak in favor of the plan which has been submitted by Landmark, which would preserve the sanctuary, but allow for the development, which I think would be good for the community as well, and will allow us as a congregation to move forward and find a new home which is better suited for the size that we are today and what we can afford. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else looking to speak?
I just would like to comment. My name is Kate Auwater. I'm the preservation planner for the city and staff to the preservation board. And I just did want to clarify for everyone in attendance here that no plans have been officially submitted to the city regarding any future development. You've seen some conceptual designs that have been circulated in the paper and so forth. So when the last number of speakers have spoken about the plan that has been submitted, these, as I say, are conceptual and also are not, part of this discussion today. So.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else looking to speak in opposition?
In favor.
Or in favor? Okay, final comment. The process, just so everybody remembers, is the Landmark Preservation Board's charge at our next meeting, which will start shortly after this one is closed, is to make a determination as to whether or not this property shall be designated as a local protected site in part or whole. That recommendation goes to the Planning Commission of the City of Syracuse, and if the Planning Commission of the City of Syracuse upholds it, the final decision for designation goes to the Common Council. So we just want everybody to be very well aware of the process. So with that, hearing and seeing...
Can I ask a point of information?
Sure.
It was unclear. Just a point of information. It was unclear from the testimony, and maybe you can clarify, is the board, is the mandate of the board, can you designate one part of the parcel and not the entire parcel?
The entire parcel, the entire parcel, the land, the site, will be part of any designation if so recommended. The structures on that site, it depends.
Okay, so then there's room for negotiation.
Yeah, so
Okay.
it can be contributing. And
Yeah, there could be contributing and non-contributing, and significant and not significant. But the actual site, the entire plot, if in fact any designation takes place, will be part of the designation. Okay. So with that, hearing and seeing nothing else, the public hearing is closed. Thank you. We'll take just a 2 or 3 minute recess before we start our regularly scheduled meeting.